Do you know that with the change in monetary policy in regard to MSF, that is marginal standing facility, and TLTRO, that is targeted long-term repo rate, liquidity in the banking system will augment by rupees 2,87,000 crore post RBI announcement on 27th of March 2020 and 17th April 2020. Friends, this is CA Aditya Maheshwari. I have already covered some of the important banking terminology like CRR, SLR, repo rate, reverse repo rate in the first part of my series on Cornomics on RBI announcements. I'll request you to refer first part of the video to have an understanding of these terminologies. Dear friends, in this part of the series, we are going to discuss what is marginal standing facility and what is TLTRO, targeted long-term repo operations. We'll conclude with their effects on our economy because of RBI announcements, post-COVID lockdowns. Now, we'll move to understand what is marginal standing facility. Marginal standing facility is a very similar term to repo operations. If a bank requires fund over and above of the repo funding, it again approaches Reserve Bank of India to borrow more funds in the name of marginal standing facility. So in simpler language, marginal standing facility is a technique through which banks borrow from Reserve Bank of India. Since the concept of repo and marginal standing facility are very similar, it would be better for us to understand this terminology by understanding the difference between repo and marginal standing facility. Under repo mechanism, collateral securities are practically first sold to Reserve Bank of India with a binding option to repurchase it after an agreed period. Whereas marginal standing facility mechanism is a relatively simpler terminology wherein banks simply borrow the fund from Reserve Bank of India in lieu of pledging the collateral securities. Under repo mechanism, interest is paid in the form of difference between selling price and repurchase price by banks to RBI. Whereas in case of marginal standing facilities, it is very relatively simpler. Interest is directly paid on the borrowing amount. Under repo, the securities which are retained to maintain mandatory liquidity under SLR requirements of RBI cannot be offered as collateral security for sale and repurchase. It means additional investments are supposed to be offered as collateral security in case of repo, whereas for marginal standing facility borrowings, up to 3% of SLR securities can also be offered as collateral securities. It means the funds which are blocked for maintaining SLR can also be reutilized for borrowing under MSF up to 3% of NDTL, that is net deposit and time liabilities. Normally we refer it as deposits. Repo interest presently is 4.40%, whereas for MSF it is slightly higher at 4.65%. So any bank will first prefer to borrow at repo and thereafter will move to marginal standing facility. Presently, maximum of 1% of NDTL can only be borrowed under repo mechanism. Thereafter, if the banks want to borrow more from Reserve Bank of India, they opt out to borrow under MSF mechanism. Marginal standing facility allows dip in SLR by 3% of NDTL, that is net deposit and time liabilities. Prior to COVID lockdown announcement, it was 2%. So, on 27th March 2020, the Reserve Bank of India has given the relaxation of dip in SLR. Instead of 2%, they have allowed it 3%. With the relaxation in dip in SLR from 2% to 3%, rupees 1,37,000 crore extra is estimated to be augmented in banking system by way of additional loan from Reserve Bank of India. Let's try to understand it more. Present SLR limit is 18%. I would like to add on here that in my first part of this series of video, I have told that SLR requirement is 18.5% of NDTL, which has now been reduced further to 18%. It means the banks have to keep 18% of net deposit and time liability as liquid asset with themselves. And out of these investments, 3% of the deposits can be utilized as collateral security for MSF. So banks can now borrow up to 3% of deposits. So indirectly, the banks, we can say that SLR has been reduced to 15%. How come? 18% of SLR, and out of that 3% can be pledged and again taken as a loan. So net the funds which gets blocked for the bank is netted, we can say it is netted to 15%. Friends, we will now try to understand a relatively more newer terminology, that is targeted long-term repo operations, commonly known as TLTRO. Normally, repo borrowings and MSF borrowings are short-term in nature. Mostly, these are either overnight or for 7 to 28 days. Whereas TLTRO, as the name suggests, are long-term in nature. Again, TLTRO is also a kind of borrowing from Reserve Bank of India of a long-term nature. Earlier, long duration term loans to the tune of 0.75% of NDTL were allowed to be borrowed from RBI under repo mechanism. But earlier, long term does not mean 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. Again, long term means 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, 12 months, not beyond it. But now this 0.75% limit has been withdrawn and any long term loans are regulated under TLTRO mode. The duration of these loans is 1 year to 3 years, and hence it brings stability in the movement of the funds for long term duration. It's only couple of years of introduction of TLTRO in our country. The interest rate of TLTRO is linked with repo rate, which are monitored by RBI on a bi-monthly basis. TLTRO stands for targeted, I repeat, targeted long-term repo operations. Let's now try to understand the relevance of the word target in TLTRO. Whenever RBI announces TLTRO scheme, it sets the area or say target wherein the proceeds of the borrowing are to be utilized by banks once the amount will be given by RBI to the respective banks. The RBI can set the target to be the agricultural sector or a MSME sector or some other targeted investments. These targets are defined by RBI before announcing TLTRO. So at the time of whenever RBI announces any auction of fresh loans, at that point of time it announces that the area wherein the proceeds are to be utilized. As I said, TLTRO is a new concept in our country and has been introduced by RBI in very recent years. Post-COVID lockdown announcement, RBI has offered to give loans under TLTRO mechanism to the tune of 1,50,000 crores in two tranches. Rupees 1 lakh crore was announced on 27th of March 2020 and rupees 50,000 crore has been announced on 17th of April 2020. This will lead to augmentation of the liquidity position of the bank. The target investment of these amount has been set by RBI and shall be made by the borrowing banks in either corporate bonds or commercial papers or non-convertible debentures. The second tranche of 50,000 are to be invested in these three, but the second tranche 50% of the amount shall be invested in MSE or small and medium finance institutions. These investments shall be categorized as HTM, that is held till maturity investments in the books of the respective banks. For sure, I am expecting that this is going to augment the liquidity position within the economy. Friends, we must appreciate the initiatives of RBI. The entire globe, including our country, is already facing economic crisis because of lockdowns. I am yet trying to do some research that what liquidity crisis may come because of this corona crisis. But for sure RBI is taking enough of initiatives to increase the liquidity position to counter the downgrade in liquidity that might come in our economy. Hence, RBI is announcing various relief measures to continue liquidity in the economy. These are very, very welcome move. Let's summarize various initiatives taken by RBI to increase liquidity in their announcements either on 27th of March 2020 or 17th of April 2020. The CRR has been reduced from 4% to 3%, which will lead to augment liquidity to the tune of 1,37,000 crores. New additional loan in the name of TLTRO shall be given by RBI to various banks to the tune of 1,50,000 crores. With the relaxation of MSF borrowing norms by allowing dip in SLR from 2% to 3%, liquidity is expected to augment again by 1,37,000 crores. An additional loan of 50,000 crores shall be given by RBI to financial institutions like NABARD, SIDBI and National Housing Board for subsequent refinancing by these financial institutions to SME sector and housing sector. Repo rate has been reduced by 0.75%, which lead to reduction in loan rate to general public and corporate sector. SLR limit has been reduced from 18.5% to 18%, which will lead to augmentation of liquidity approximately by 68,000 crores. Reverse repo rate has been reduced twice cumulatively by 1.15%, which will now discourage banks to deposit additional funds to Reserve Bank of India, leading to disbursement of more loans to corporates and general public, as these sectors will give better earning to the banking sector than that of RBI, because the reverse repo rate has been reduced at large. With this, friends, I would wish to conclude. Thank you, Namaskar and Jai Hind.